Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to speak in English because my Spanish is terrible. I would love to speak it, but I can't. Can you start my presentation? Yeah, this one here.
Es un PDF, ¿no? Gracias.
It's a PDF.
So I switch to English.
Bueno, cambio a inglés, me siento.
Especially with just 20 minutes and having to move fast. Speaking a language which I don't speak is too much of a challenge. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's exciting to be here. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Undoing neoliberalism. Degrowth is a radical, not the, but one of many radical alternatives to the global crisis. So some of you know this picture already. Apologies about that. Some of you might not. Let me start with the tale of growth. Capitalistic growth has played an essentially structural role to stabilize the prosperity story of the global north. This is what I call, with some of my colleagues, we worked on that, a dynamic stabilization via growth. And the best example is putting a hamster on a bicycle. So a bicycle stabilizes itself but continuously moving forward, or it falls down. The crazy bicycle of capitalistic growth is a bicycle that has to constantly accelerate in order not to fall down. And this is exactly how it has been stabilizing the tale of growth by guaranteeing social pacification, legitimation of democracy, and the like. Now, the prosperity story masks its parasitic nature, which is colonialism, extractivism, then the patriarchal division of labor, and so on. Development as growth was never meant to be for all, because it is intrinsically parasitic. La siguiente, por favor. Since the 70s, we're getting increasingly aware that growth is no longer easily achievable, is no longer easily working. Growth encounters a crisis due to internal contradictions of this crazy bicycle and due to the threshold, the social and ecological threshold that has been thematized, for example, by the limits to growth of the Club of Rome. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good. And also because of the increasing crisis of legitimation of the tale of prosperity related to growth, and because of resistance and movements against that. La siguiente. Now, I think that neoliberalism, or the neoliberal restructuring of society, is, among others, the answer to the crisis of growth that we're starting to get aware of in the 70s. The story is more complicated. This is simplified, but bear with me. So neoliberalism is an answer to the crisis, is a project of expansion of the capacity to exploit in all dimensions, in a literal and metaphorical dimension. La siguiente. So the neoliberal restructuring of society after the crisis of easy growth operates via the capitalistic valorization of life's creative energy. So it's operate no longer against life, but with life for further capitalistic accumulation. I think that the lesson was very well learned from the Club of Rome and from ecological economics. It was an answer to secure scarce resources and sinks for the rich, and to tap into life's productivity in a more direct way. And life's productivity in a literal sense, like the genes, but also in the sense of our own creativity of emotions. La siguiente. So the neoliberal restructuring of society has been operating differently in different contexts and hybridizing these different mode of operations. Not so much in the north versus the south, but in core and peripheralized regions where regions is not a geographical term, but it refers to different fields, area, groups. This is the face of neoliberalism that we all know best and have been discussed and thematized during this conference. The first mode of operation as violent globalization, the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein mentions, traditional neo-extractivism, with the goal of increasing the marketization of life processes, both social and ecological. And it operates through an expansion in space and time. In space, literally, land grabbing, appropriating land, and metaphorically extending the commodification frontier, commodifying ecosystem services. And also it operates as an expansion in time. The further intensification of the pace of life is an expansion in time. La siguiente. Other mode of operation is, as I mentioned before, tapping into life's own productivity and creative or poietic activity. And we can think of all this bio, which is so much fashionable nowadays for the new reasoning of green growth and capitalistic growth, bioeconomy, biopiracy, and biomimicry, which are rather positive terms, which is really about how to exploit further the own functioning of life, of course, without considering within this process the condition of reproduction and regeneration of life, which have to be secured. And this is why this mode of operation is fundamentally parasitic on the reproductive activities of life, again, both social and ecological. And because the reproduction of life has to be guaranteed, the mode of operation of neoliberal capitalism, and it is not new in this, is not a direct valorization of the reproduction of life, is not including it into the logic of capitalistic accumulation, but by indirect control, just the opposite, via devaluation of all reproductive activity. And here, following feminists, I cannot separate the social and the ecological, because it's not just care as the regeneration of labor, but also the regeneration of resources and sinks. They do not regenerate all alone without human labor put into that. Think of the cleaning after the mess, especially how the electronic waste is being recycled, mainly in India or Africa, under terrible conditions. Or again, it's transferred to other social groups and other places in the world. La siguiente. But there is also another mode of operation of neoliberalism, which is less evidently violent and is more subtle and insidious, if you wish, which is the structuring of the action field of individuals who have to feel like being free without forcing them violently, creating a space for a dream, like the American dream, colonizing the social imaginary, which justifies practices, action, and even interactions. Here is a definition, I'm not reading it, but it's one possible definition of the social imaginary. And it operates by forming new subjectivities. We cannot be subjects isolated from others. We can be subjects only because we are being seen and recognized by others. We cannot exist without that. So we can become subject only if we adapt to expectations, to patterns of reciprocal recognition. So the pervasive and dominant paradigm of neoliberalism shapes social expectations and molds patterns of social acceptability, how to be acceptable in society. And again, it taps into social relation, creativity, emotions, desire. This is the business model of Facebook, to tap into our social relation and make money out of it. desire is the most powerful, energetic flux that exists. Mobilizing desire is very important to create and continue this narrative and to make us willing slaves of capital. The emotional appeal of neoliberal capitalism is rooted in the use and functionalization of creative desire. For example, the craving for innovation, like for the iPhone, right? And it operates by activating. How interesting that this word activation is used for genes, but is also used in the social realm to activate people to move more, to, you know, to take on their responsibility, to improve their health. It's the same term. Interesting. La siguiente. And the mode of operation has the goal of forming subjectivities in which we understand ourselves as entrepreneur, more than that, ourselves as an enterprise. It's the universalization of the entrepreneurial logic. We should feel managers in all sectors. Time management, life management. I receive emails from my health provider, I live in the US, offering me a coach to manage my weight. So it's really about understanding yourself and your body as your own enterprise, as your capital that you invest into. So you invest in health, in education, in social links, not relations. These are links. It's different. And it generalizes the risk. If you're an enterprise, you're responsible for your risks. You are responsible for your failures. So it's an extension of the logic of competition. And it's not just the narrative of more. It's also the narrative of better, which is pervasive. It's the idea of self-improvement, self-enhancement, constant innovation in ourselves. How tiring that is. But it's part of that mode of operation. La siguiente. Now, this is a different bicycle. And is a metaphor for what I think that degrowth ultimately is. It's not just about voluntary frugality. It is about radically changing the frame of society. It is a different bicycle. This bicycle doesn't have to constantly accelerate in order not to fall down. It's not about going back. It can move. And more than that, this is a Danish model. It's a commons-based design bicycle. It can be reshaped according to the needs of those who use it. This is a metaphor. And of course, it clearly represents in this picture, which I found, the fact that degrowth is rooted in a language, in the discourse of the global north. But I think that the vision of degrowth is about transforming at all three levels, institutions, the social imaginary, and which is most important, collective practices, which eventually coagulate into institutions. La siguiente, por favor. As in French, décroissance or degrowth, people say degrowth is a mot obus, is a shell, a missile word. It hits as a wedge the core of the neoliberal project. It unveils the contradictions of the neoliberal growth logic and questions the economic structure and the cultural infrastructure that justifies it. It unmasks the tale of prosperity and development by displaying how it is parasitic onto other human and non-human others. And at the point of the crisis of growth, it offers an alternative narrative to the neoliberal restructuring of society. And it's about liberating life from the neoliberal appropriation. La siguiente. So within the wonderful, creative, and colorful pluriverse of resistances, degrowth can, and sometimes it has operated that way, operate as a dialogue, as a bridge to two different types of resistance. More antagonistic mode of resistance and more prefigurative, those who embody in the practices of today alternative possibilities for the future. So it has operated to a certain extent as that kind of dialogue and platform. For example, between the climate camps, more antagonistic, and other movements such as in Europe, the rather much less radical transitions down movement. But this has to be connected, just as the struggles in the north has to be connected with the struggles in the south. La siguiente. So, can degrowth be a project of decolonization? This is tricky and risky and problematic. So this is why I have a question mark up there. I think it can offer something to a project of decolonization, but first of all, and I think I am one of the most responsible for that with others, I always say degrowth as decolonization of the imaginary, and I tend to forget, because of my bias living in the global north, that decolonization for the majority of the people in this world is much more material than that. So if it has to be a project of decolonization, it has to be, first of all, a material restitution. All this I'm saying is Miriam Lang, and I really thank her for that. She said that in Malmo, so it's not me, it's her. And it's not just about restituting money. In some context, it might be okay, it depends, right? But there is the risk that just restituting money reiterates the neoliberal narrative, because it's very corrupting, and it recreates this idea of poverty as we have heard, right? And it gives people income while at the same time depriving them of their livelihoods and, more than anything, of their autonomy. So it's about restituting the materiality of conditions for living in dignity and in autonomy. It's water, land, time, air, relations. These are the material conditions for livelihood sovereignty. And if degrowth wants to become a project of decolonization, this is one essential element that has to be there to contrast the violent phase of the modus operandi, the mode of operation of neoliberalism. But of course, it's also true that we need a decolonization of the neoliberal imaginary, which is difficult because it is so inscribed in our bodies and in the way we interact with each other. It's so pervasive. So I do think that in this case, subversive practices is what we need, and we need laboratories of liberation, which are protected spaces in which we can feel, experience, and play, experiment alternative forms of life are possible and how they feel. Social experiments are laboratories where we can reappropriate and liberate desire. La siguiente. So, I think this is my last. And talking about decolonizing desire, I am borrowing from the queer movement the concept of undoing neoliberalism. If the other mode of operation of neoliberalism is this operating indirectly on the field of action, we need to create other fields of action, create conditions for alternative subjectivities where we envision but also embody other modes of living together. And it's essential here, the care for daily relations, for bodies, for emotion. Thanks so much for organizing the circle today. It was so needed. I really needed it. This is the daily space for breathing. Given the pervasiveness of the neoliberal mode of molding subjectivities, forms of resistance in this particular mode don't have to be cannot be necessarily antagonistic, but it's really about shifting, twisting, resignifying the dominant norms of and the meanings in different ways. And here is where I think that the degrowth movement can learn so much from the queer movement. because in the queer movement, the language uses undoing gender, because you cannot just get up tomorrow and decide to go beyond that. It's so pervasive, it's so embodied, it constitutes our bodies. So undoing gender is a subversive practice that challenges the pervasive logic and power of heteronormativity. And I think that neoliberalism has a similar pervasiveness as the logic of heteronormativity. So these practices are important to learn from, to shift and create spaces for liberation. And summing up and concluding, it's really about common acting, agir commun, as Dardot says, in subversive social experiments to create conditions for alternative subjectivities in which different and differing processes of self-transformation can take place. Thank you very much.